The warning came at the stroke of midnight. Aisha Kane didn't use an envelope. She used a shadow. Kwon Ji-hoon sat behind a desk carved from the kind of power that usually bought silence, but tonight the silence was heavy. He looked down at the note she had left under the golden glow of the rooftop bar. Thick paper, words like a jagged blade. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a countdown. He picked up his secure line. "Do-hyun," he rasped, his eyes fixed on the city lights of Seoul moving below him, indifferent to the war brewing in his office. "The Helix deal. Is it a trap?" A pause on the other end. "It's a frame-up, sir," Do-hyun said, his voice tight. "If you sign at midnight, you aren't just losing the company. You're losing your life." The host for the signing. He doesn't let people leave once the ink is dry. Ji-hoon stood up and walked to the window. He didn't quail. He studied the reflection of the room. He needed an edge, not just a weapon but a ghost. Someone who could walk into a room full of the most lethal wolves in the city and make them believe she was the one holding the leash. He thought of the waitress. The one with the steady tray and eyes sharper than a cold-rolled steel edge. He picked up his phone and dialed a number he had never used directly in 14 months. Aisha answered on the first ring. She was in the outer office, her hands steady as she finished a task no one had asked her to do, her mind already 3 steps ahead of the chaos. "Sir," she said, her voice a calm current in a storm. "Aisha," Ji-hoon said, and for the first time the command in his voice was shadowed by a request. "I'm asking for something outside your contract. You can walk away and I won't stop you. But if you stay, you aren't an assistant anymore. You're the only reason I'm going to walk out of that room alive." Aisha stopped what she was doing. She looked at the city glittering outside, then at the lie behind her own smile in the glass. She listened to the stakes. The Helix frame-up, the venomous deal, the blades waiting in the neon dark. She didn't say a word until he was finished. Then her smile turned into something softer, something more dangerous. "I don't walk into a room unprepared," she said. "If I'm in, we do it my way." Above them the city glittered. Below, the war had just begun. The rain began as a cold, rhythmic pulse against the pavement, turning the neon signs of Seoul into bleeding streaks of cobalt and crimson. Kwon Ji-hoon didn't look back as he stepped into the narrow throat of the alley, his hand tight around Aisha's wrist. Behind them, the elite rooftop bar was a gilded cage they had just shattered. Ahead, the air tasted of wet iron and impending violence. "Helix didn't just want the signature," Ji-hoon growled, his breath hitching as he scanned the shadows. "They wanted the burial." The trap didn't spring with a shout. It surfaced like a predator from deep water. 6 men materialized from the gloom, the light catching the wicked curve of specialized blades. Ji-hoon felt the familiar surge of adrenaline, the jagged electric heat of a man who refused to fall. But as he stepped forward to shield the woman he thought was a liability, the world shifted. Aisha didn't scream. She didn't cower. She simply let go of the tray she was still holding, and the sound of it hitting the ground was the last thing the first attacker ever heard. She moved like a hurricane wrapped in silk. In the strobe light flicker of the neon, Ji-hoon watched the waitress vanish. In her place was a whirlwind of lethal precision. Her heels, once a fashion statement, became weapons of leverage. Her hands, which had served champagne an hour ago, were now breaking bones with the clinical efficiency of a professional executioner. "Stay down," she commanded, her voice a low, guttural snap that brooked no argument. They fought back to back, a frantic dance of shadows and steel. Ji-hoon struck with the raw power of a street fighter, but Aisha was a ghost, a blur of motion that anticipated the enemy's reach before they even moved. He saw her take a blade meant for his ribs, twisting the attacker's arm until the joint shrieked, her expression never losing that terrifying frozen calm. Lies burned away in the chaos of the rain. The assistant who had filed his papers for 14 months was gone, replaced by a woman who moved through the blood and the mud as if she had been born in it. When the last man hit the ground, the only sound left was the ragged harmony of their breathing and the distant, lonely wail of sirens. Ji-hoon turned, pinning her against the damp brick wall, his chest heaving. His eyes were dark, searching her face for a trace of the woman he thought he knew, finding only the cold, beautiful reality of the one standing before him. "Who are you?" he whispered, the question more dangerous than the knives they had just faced. Aisha smiled, a slow, predatory curve of the lips that held no warmth. She reached up, wiping a smear of rain and red from her cheek. The only reason you're still alive, she said softly. Above them, the city glittered, indifferent and blind. Below, in the dark, the man who owned everything realized he finally had something he couldn't buy. The steam rose from the wet asphalt like a ghost, curling around them as Ji-hoon kept her pinned against the rough, cold brick. His hand was still tight on her shoulder, his knuckles white, the adrenaline in his veins refusing to subside. He was a man who had built an empire on knowing every variable, every shadow, and every secret in this city. Yet, looking into Aisha's eyes, he realized he was staring into a void he couldn't map. 14 months, he rasped, his voice cutting through the distant, lonely wail of sirens. 14 months you sat 10 feet from my door, filing my life away in folders. You were a mistake waiting to happen, they said. A quiet, efficient girl from Ethiopia with a graduate scholarship and a steady hand. But waitresses don't dismantle professional hit squads in the rain. Waitresses don't move like death in silk. Aisha didn't quail. She didn't struggle against his weight. She stood entirely still, completely herself, unbothered by the size of the man or the danger of the moment. The rain slicked her hair, making the dark curls shine under the flickering red neon, but her gaze remained as level as a horizon. You're looking for a lie, Ji-hoon, she said softly, her voice a calm current beneath his storm. But the girl who organized your schedule was real. The girl who knew your coffee order and kept your secrets was real. I just didn't tell you there were other secrets I was keeping for myself. Ji-hoon's suspicion battled a sudden, sharp fascination that felt more dangerous than the blades they'd just faced. He saw the small photograph of her mother she kept on her desk in his mind's eye, the only piece of real he thought he knew about her. Now everything was fractured. He wanted to break her code, to find the helix connection, to know if she was a guardian or the ultimate Trojan horse. Are you mine? He whispered, his face inches from hers, his eyes dark with a possessiveness he hadn't given permission to exist. Or am I just the mark you're protecting until the highest bidder calls? Aisha reached up, her fingers grazing his wrist, not to pull away but to steady him. Her touch was warm, a startling contrast to the freezing night. I told you, sir. I do not walk into a room unprepared. She leaned in, her voice dropping to a lethal, intimate velvet. You didn't expect me to be more dangerous than your enemies. That was your first mistake. Your second would be thinking you can own a ghost. He didn't let go. He couldn't. The city glittered above them, indifferent and cold, but in the dark of that alley, the man who knew every move realized he had no idea what happened next. The next morning, the office was a tomb of expensive silence. Kwon Ji-hoon didn't send his assistant to summon her. He stood in the doorway himself, his silhouette cutting a hard line against the glass and steel. He walked in and sat across from her, his eyes tracking her every movement with the same predatory focus he used in a boardroom execution. He didn't see a waitress anymore. He saw a weapon he didn't yet control. There are more gatherings, he said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. 6 weeks from now, then 2 months after that. The requirement remains the same, a partner. But Helix has changed the game. I can't arrive with a stranger and I can't arrive alone. If I do, the conversation shifts to my funeral. Aisha looked at him, her expression as unreadable as the encrypted files on his desk. One evening was one evening, sir, she said, her voice cool and professional. I am your assistant. Nothing more. Ji-hoon leaned forward, the shadows of the room deepening around him. I know exactly what you are, Aisha. That's why I'm not asking. I'm offering a formal contract, separate from your work here. Its own terms, its own blood-soaked compensation. He pushed a folder across the desk, the golden cage. It wasn't just a paycheck, it was an anchor. I need you to move into the house. People watch outside events. If you only appear when bullets start flying, they'll know the lie. You'll have your own wing, your own hours, and I'll maintain your apartment as it sits. You give up nothing, but you give me your shadow. Aisha studied the man who thought he could buy the wind. She looked at the filing system she had built with her own 2 hands, the life she had carefully constructed inside these walls. She knew that if she said no, he would find another way, but no other way would keep him breathing. Any time, she said, her voice dropping to that dangerous velvet snap. If anything feels wrong, if the line shifts, I walk out. No questions, no penalties, no conversation. Ji-hoon held her gaze, a flicker of something close to a smile touching the corner of his mouth. Agreed. Send me the contract, she said, already looking back at her desk, dismissing the most powerful man in Seoul as if he were just another file to be organized. The war had moved from the alleyway to the mahogany halls of his estate. Ji-hoon walked out knowing he had successfully trapped a ghost, but wondering for the first time if he was the one who had just been locked inside. The venue in Cheongdam was a fortress of glass and silence, the kind of building that didn't announce the sins committed inside its walls. Aisha stepped out of the black sedan, and the air around her seemed to crystallize. She had traded the tactical steel of the alley for a gown that moved like liquid shadow, chosen not to impress the wolves in the room, but to communicate one lethal truth. She belonged there and she had always known it. Ji-hoon watched her, his own expression a mask of granite composure, though for a fraction of a second something in his eyes shifted, a recognition of the power he had tried to cage. "Ready?" he rasped. Aisha didn't blink. Yes. They moved through the gala like twin blades. The room was a minefield of expensive suits and careful smiles, where every word spoken aloud was a lie covering the jagged intent underneath. Ji-hoon read the room, identifying the predators, assessing Aisha for a weakness they could exploit later. They didn't find one. She stayed close to him, her hand resting naturally on his arm, her laugh coming at the precise moments required to sell the performance. Director Lim approached, his smile failing to reach his cold eyes. "Ji-hoon, I wasn't sure you'd make it," he said, his gaze immediately sliding to Aisha. Before Ji-hoon could draw breath to speak, Aisha held out her hand, her voice a smooth current of silk and ice. "Aisha Kane," she said, meeting Lim's stare with a level of confidence that made the older man falter. "I have heard interesting things about you." Lim laughed, a sharp, hollow sound, and looked at Ji-hoon with something bordering on genuine approval. "You have good taste," he remarked before retreating into the crowd. As he moved away, Aisha didn't look at Ji-hoon, her eyes fixed on the horizon of the room. "He tested 2 of your associates last year," she said quietly, her voice dropping into that professional, lethal register. "Do-hyun briefed me thoroughly." Ji-hoon felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. He realized he hadn't just hired a partner, he had unleashed a force that saw the battlefield better than he did. She worked the room with the clinical efficiency of a woman who had grown up in these shadows, never too eager, always one step ahead of the next betrayal. Ji-hoon stood beside her, the most powerful man in the city, realizing he was merely a passenger in the world she was currently reinventing. The high society gala was a hum of expensive whispers and the clinking of crystal until the first shot shattered the illusion. It didn't sound like a movie. It was a sharp, dry crack that tore through a nearby window, sending a spray of glass across the marble floor like diamonds in the dark. Ji-hoon didn't think. He moved with the raw instinct of a man who had survived 1,000 betrayals, lunging for Aisha. But she was already moving, her liquid shadow of a gown flaring as she pivoted, her hand locking onto his collar and dragging him behind a massive stone pillar before the second round could find its mark. "Down!" she hissed, her voice a serrated edge in the sudden, panicked silence of the room. They were pressed together in the narrow sanctuary of the stone, the smell of her perfume mixing with the acrid scent of gunpowder and the ozone of the rain outside. Ji-hoon could feel the frantic, heavy thud of his own heart, but Aisha's breathing was a rhythmic, terrifying calm. She wasn't hiding, she was calculating. Her eyes scanned the perimeter, reading the geometry of the room, her body coiled like a spring. "The shot came from the east wing, 3rd floor, she whispered, her gaze never wavering. "He's using a suppressed bolt action. He's not looking for a crowd, he's looking for a specific heart." Ji-hoon looked at the woman pinned against him, the heat of her body a stark contrast to the cold granite at their backs. He had spent his life believing he was the sun that all the shadows orbited, the primary target, the ultimate prize. But as a third shot chipped the stone inches above Aisha's head, he saw the truth in the spray of dust. The shooter wasn't adjusting for him. Every microcorrection, every lethal intent, was focused entirely on the waitress in the emerald dress. "They aren't here for me, Aisha," Ji-hoon rasped, his voice thick with a realization that felt like a physical blow. "Helix isn't just framing me. They're trying to erase you." Aisha didn't look at him. She reached into the folds of her gown, her fingers closing around something metallic and cold. "Then we shouldn't keep them waiting," she said, a slow, predatory smile touching her lips. In the flickering light of the dying chandeliers, Ji-hoon saw the ghost he had tried to cage fully emerge. He had thought he was protecting her with a golden cage contract, but as she stepped out into the line of fire to draw the shooter's eye, he realized he was just the spectator to a war she had been fighting long before he knew her name. The adrenaline from the gala had cooled into a lethal heavy stillness by the time Aisha retreated to the east corridor of the mansion. While Ji-hoon paced his office like a caged wolf, she sat at the small desk in her room, the photograph of her mother watching from the windowsill. The encrypted Helix file she had pulled from the server during the chaos was finally unraveling, its digital layers stripping away to reveal a truth more jagged than any sniper's bullet. Her eyes, sharper than any weapon in the room, tracked the flow of offshore accounts and shell companies. The trail didn't lead to a rival conglomerate or a foreign agency. It doubled back, weaving through the very foundations of the Kwon estate. She saw the signatures, the authorizations that bypassed Ji-hoon's own security protocols. Clear, undeniable evidence that the betrayal wasn't just corporate, it was ancestral. The call was coming from inside the house. Aisha leaned back, the blue light of the screen reflecting in her dark, steady gaze. She knew the man in the other wing was a man who didn't trust easily, a man who viewed the world as a transaction to be managed. He had built an empire from the ground up, believing he was the sun his shadows orbited, yet he was blind to the rot in his own bloodline. She thought about his mother, the small woman who dressed with such careful effort and was dismissed in 30 seconds. She thought about the flowers Ji-hoon used to put on the table before dawn and the man who had lost the way back to his own heart. To tell him was to shatter the only world he had left. To remain silent was to let the trap snap shut around him. The decision didn't weigh on her. She was a ghost, an operative who had decided a long time ago exactly how much space she would occupy in this war. She closed the laptop, the click echoing in the quiet room that felt completely unlived in. She stood up and walked to the door, her hand hovering over the handle. In the dark of the corridor, lies were burning away, and she had to decide if she was his protector or the one who would deliver the final, crushing blow. The chandeliers of the Sheila ballroom hung like frozen explosions of light, casting a predatory glow over a room filled with the most dangerous smiles in Seoul. Aisha moved through the crowd with the liquid grace of a high-end operative, her hand resting naturally on Ji-hoon's arm in a performance that had become a second skin. The requirement was absolute. Every attendee must come with their partner, or they wouldn't leave the building alive. Ji-hoon played the part of the obsessed lover with a raw intensity that made the air between them thick enough to choke on. He pulled her closer than the contract required, his hand warm and heavy at the small of her back, a physical anchor in a sea of corporate sharks. Every time his fingers brushed the skin of her shoulder, a jagged current of electricity shot through her, a sensation that had no place in a professional mission. "They're watching the gaps, Aisha," he whispered against her ear, his breath a hot, dangerous ghost on her neck. "Chairman O is looking for the space between us that doesn't close the way it should." She leaned into him, her head almost touching his, the scent of his expensive cologne mixing with the cold metallic tang of the hidden weapon she carried beneath her silk gown. For a moment, the mission, the Helix betrayal, and the lies they had constructed burned away in the heat of his proximity. The performance was supposed to be a shield, but as his thumb traced the line of her jaw, the distance in her eyes began to thin out. When the music slowed to a low, rhythmic pulse, he turned her to face him, his eyes dark with a question he didn't want to ask out loud. The room believed it completely because the small nod she gave him wasn't a tactical move. It was a surrender to a truth neither of them was naming. He kissed her, soft, brief, the absolute minimum required. But as his lips met hers, the absolute minimum felt like everything. Aisha pulled back, her heart a frantic, heavy drum against her ribs. She looked at the man who had hired her to be a ghost and realized the golden cage had no bars. It was built from the very touches she was starting to crave. Above them, the city glittered, indifferent to the war. Between them, the deception had reached a degree where the fake was the only thing that felt real. The silence of the Kwon estate was shattered at 3 a.m., not by an explosion, but by the hollow synthetic chirp of a perimeter breach. Ji-hoon lunged for the handgun in his nightstand, his heart a frantic, heavy drum, but before he could clear the holster, the door to his suite swept open. It wasn't the enemy, it was Aisha. She wasn't wearing silk or heels. She was a shadow in tactical black, a comms piece nestled in her ear and a suppressed rifle held with the clinical ease of a woman who had never known a situation she couldn't master. Stay behind me and do exactly what I say, she commanded, her voice a low, guttural snap that brooked no ego. Ji-hoon, the man who had built an empire from the ground up and never found himself without a move, stood in paralyzed awe as the waitress took total tactical command of his world. She didn't just fight, she orchestrated. She moved through the corridors with a rhythmic, terrifying calm, her eyes reading the geometry of the shadows before the intruders could even draw breath. Every movement was a statement of fact, a display of competence porn that made the golden cage feel like a playground for children. 2 on the West Terrace suppressed submachines, she whispered, her gaze fixed on a tablet she pulled from her belt. They're using Helix protocols. They aren't here for the files, they're here for the heart. She bypassed his own security, the men who bowed to him but failed to see the rot in the house, and rewrote the defensive grid in seconds. When the first team of assassins breached the library, Aisha didn't quail. She became a whirlwind of lethal precision, her rifle barked 3 times, and the threat was neutralized before Ji-hoon could even level his own weapon. Lies were burning away in the acrid scent of gunpowder. Ji-hoon watched her, his breath rough, realizing that the woman he had tried to hire was the only person in Seoul who actually saw the battlefield for what it was. She wasn't just his protector. She was the commander of a war he hadn't realized he was losing. When the estate fell silent again, Aisha didn't look for a thank you. She simply checked her magazine and looked toward the garden, her expression settled into a cold, beautiful peace. Ji-hoon sat at his desk, the city of Seoul glittering indifferently outside, knowing he had successfully trapped a ghost, only to realize he was the one who finally understood what it meant to be saved. The adrenaline of the breach had settled into a cold, heavy silence that tasted of gunpowder and expensive whiskey. Kwon Ji-hoon sat at his mahogany desk, the city of Seoul glittering indifferently outside his window like a map of everything he thought he owned. Across from him, Aisha Kane stood with the complete calm of a woman who had just dismantled an assassination squad and was already looking for the next exit. You saved my life again, Ji-hoon rasped, his voice a low, guttural vibration in the quiet room. He pulled a folder from his desk, not the golden cage this time but something far more absolute. The Helix betrayal goes deeper than I realized. I need you here, Aisha. Not as an assistant. Not on a temporary contract. I want to offer you a permanent position, total control of my security, a stake in the conglomerate, and a number that makes your current compensation look like pocket change. He pushed the paper toward her, his eyes dark with the possessive intensity of a man who viewed the world as a series of acquisitions. He expected a negotiation. He expected her to name a price he could double without blinking. Aisha didn't even look at the folder. She looked at him, her gaze as level as a horizon and twice as distant. You think this is about the money, sir? She asked, her voice a dangerous velvet snap. You think you can buy the ghost that just saved your empire? She leaned back slightly, the light of the desk lamp catching the sharp, beautiful angles of her face. I told you when I moved in. If anything feels wrong, I walk out. No questions, no penalties. She stood up, her movement fluid and effortless, and walked toward the door without taking the contract. I gave you my word for the events and I will honor it, she said, stopping at the threshold without looking back. But the moment you try to own me is the moment I become the one person in this city you can't find. I'm not an asset, Ji-hoon. I'm the only person in this house who doesn't need anything from you. She walked out, the door closing with a soft final click. Ji-hoon sat in the silence, his hand still resting on the unsigned contract, realizing he had just tried to buy the wind. Above them, the city glittered. Below, the man who had never lost a negotiation realized he was currently losing the only thing that mattered. The rain returned, a relentless drumming against the floor-to-ceiling glass that overlooked the cold, electric veins of Seoul. Kwon Ji-hoon sat in the darkness of his study, the only light coming from the amber glow of a whiskey glass and the distant, flickering neon of the city he supposedly ruled. He didn't look up when the door opened. He didn't have to. He knew the rhythmic, silent tread of the woman who had become the only truth in his house. The city looks like a circuit board from up here, he rasped, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that felt like a confession. Millions of lives, millions of transactions, and not one of them cares if I breathe or bleed tonight. Power isn't a throne, Aisha. It's a sensory deprivation tank. You spend your whole life building walls to keep the enemies out, only to realize you've locked yourself in with the silence. Aisha moved into the room, her silhouette a sharp, elegant line against the storm. She didn't offer platitudes. She sat in the chair across from him, her eyes dark and steady, reflecting the broken light of the city. I was 10 when the first war came to my door, she said, her voice dropping into a soft, serrated edge. In my village, if you were seen, you were a target. If you were heard, you were a casualty. I learned early that the only way to survive a world that wants to own you or erase you is to become a ghost. I didn't choose this life because I loved the shadows. I chose it because the light was where people went to die. She looked at the photograph of her mother she carried everywhere, the one piece of real she allowed herself to hold. You're lonely because you think everyone is a tool or a threat, Ji-hoon. I'm a ghost because I refuse to be either. Ji-hoon set his glass down, the sound of crystal on mahogany sharp in the quiet. For the first time, he didn't look at her like an asset to be managed or a mystery to be solved. He looked at her like a mirror. The man who had never found himself without a move realized that the woman across from him was the only person who had ever truly seen the person underneath the name. Maybe the walls don't have to be so thick, he whispered, his hand hovering near hers on the desk, the distance between them thinning out like a spent storm. Aisha didn't pull away, but she didn't close the gap. She just watched the rain, a ghost and a king sitting together in the dark, waiting for the war to return. The envelope arrived at 9 in the morning, but it wasn't gold-lettered or refined. It was a jagged piece of the past, delivered with the clinical cruelty of a professional executioner. Aisha Kane stood by the window of the east corridor, the photograph of her mother clutched in a hand that, for the first time in 14 months, possessed a microscopic tremor. Helix hadn't sent a contract or a threat to Ji-hoon's empire this time. They had sent a coordinate, a ghost of a village she thought she had buried under a decade of silence. The message was a serrated edge. We found where the ghost was born. We know who is left. She didn't go to Ji-hoon's office to negotiate. She didn't check the filing system she had spent 3 days building into a masterpiece of order. She simply began to pack her single bag, her books, and the small photograph that had sat on every windowsill she had ever called home. The golden cage had no bars, but the weight of her history was heavier than any mahogany door. You're leaving, a voice rasped from the doorway. Ji-hoon stood there, his silhouette a hard line against the morning light. He didn't look like the man who had dismissed his mother in 30 seconds. He looked like a man who had finally realized what not attending the right room would cost him. This is outside your work scope, Aisha said, her voice a low, guttural snap that brooked no ego. You can say no. You can stay in your house of expensive silence and build your walls higher. Where are you going? He asked, stepping into the room, his eyes dark with a possessive intensity he no longer tried to hide. To finish a war that should have ended years ago, she replied, her gaze as level as a horizon. Helix thinks they can own my past. I'm going to show them that a ghost has nothing left to lose. She didn't ask for backup. She didn't ask for his resources. She looked at the man who signed her paychecks and saw the version the city whispered about, the one who made people go immediately quiet. She knew it was a suicide mission, a dance into a room full of dangerous men where no one was expected to leave. I gave my word to honor the contract, she whispered, her fingers grazing the edge of her tactical gear. But I cannot stay here and watch the world burn from behind your glass. Above them, the city of Seoul glittered, indifferent and blind. Below, in the quiet of the East Wing, Aisha Kane prepared to become the storm. The heavy iron gates of the Helix stronghold loomed ahead, a jagged silhouette of industrial steel against the bleeding horizon of the city. Kwon Ji-hoon didn't stay behind his mahogany desk or wait for a briefing from Do-hyun. He stood beside Aisha in the rain-slicked dark, his hand steady on the grip of a weapon he had once hoped he'd never have to use again. I'm not letting you walk into this room alone, he rasped, his voice a low, guttural vibration that cut through the thunder. Aisha looked at him, her eyes dark and level, reading the lack of hesitation in his face. She didn't argue, she didn't soften. She simply handed him a comms piece and checked the slide on her own suppressed rifle. Then stay 3 steps behind me, she commanded, her voice a sharp, clinical snap. And don't quail when the lights go out. They breached the perimeter like twin shadows, a rhythmic and terrifying display of synchronized lethality. In the strobe light flicker of the security hubs, the waitress and the boss vanished. In their place were two operatives who moved as if the music of the war had been written specifically for them. Ji-hoon struck with the raw, uncompromising power of a man defending his own bloodline, while Aisha moved with the liquid grace of a ghost, her movements a statement of fact that left no room for reconsideration. They navigated the corridors of Helix not as employer and asset, but as equals who had decided a long time ago exactly how much space they were going to occupy in this world. When they reached the inner sanctum, the air was thick with the acrid scent of ozone and impending consequence. Aisha didn't wait for a summons. She kicked the doors wide, her silhouette a hard line against the flickering neon of the enemy's screens. Ji-hoon was right there, his shoulder to hers, his eyes dark with the realization that the golden cage had finally been shattered. Helix thought they could own the past, Aisha whispered, her finger tightening on the trigger as the first guard moved. They forgot that ghosts don't have anything left to lose. Together they stepped into the line of fire, two people who had found the way back to themselves in the heart of the storm. The smoke from the Helix stronghold curled into the gray soul sky, a jagged shroud for a broken empire. Kwon Ji-hoon stood in the center of the wreckage, his suit ruined, his hands stained with the grit of a war he had nearly lost. He looked at Aisha, who was calmly checking her pulse, her face a mask of cold, beautiful peace. For 14 months he had told himself he was the son, the primary target, the one who held the leash. He had looked at her and seen a high-end asset, a tool to be managed, a ghost he could buy with a golden cage. The realization hit him harder than the adrenaline crash. He hadn't just been saved from a sniper's bullet or a corporate frame-up. He had been saved from the sensory deprivation tank of his own power. He had spent years building walls so thick he couldn't hear his own mother's voice. He had forgotten how to treat people who loved him for no reason, becoming a man who only understood the language of the transaction. He watched Aisha walk toward the perimeter, her silhouette a hard, independent line against the dawn. She hadn't asked for his gratitude and she hadn't waited for his permission to end the war. She had walked into his office and told him the truth when everyone else was paid to lie. "Aisha," he rasped, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that held no command, only a raw, desperate recognition. She stopped but didn't turn. "The war is over, sir. Your name is clear. The Helix files are buried. I was dead long before they pulled the trigger," Ji-hoon said, the words coming out quietly, carefully, like something he was still learning how to hold. "You didn't just save my life in that alley. You showed me the way back to the man who used to put flowers on the table." He realized then that she was the only reason he was truly alive, not because of her tactical genius or her steady hand, but because she was the only person in the city who refused to be moved by anything less than something real. He had sat in rooms with dangerous men and never felt his hands shake, but standing there watching a ghost prepare to vanish, he felt the terrifying weight of his own heart. Above them, the city glittered, indifferent to the man who had finally found himself. Below, in the ruins of the war, the boss realized he was finally ready to be a partner. Under the same golden glow where the nightmare began, the rooftop bar was a cathedral of glass and expensive secrets, the city of Seoul moving below them with its usual relentless indifference. Kwon Ji-hoon stood by the edge, the wind catching his dark hair, his eyes no longer studying a target but the woman who had redefined his world. Aisha Kane moved like a ghost in heels toward him, her tray gone, replaced by the complete ease of a woman who knew exactly what she was worth and was not going to be moved by anything less than something real. The Helix files were ashes, and the men who had sought to bury Ji-hoon were gone, yet the air between them was thicker than the smoke of the battlefield. Ji-hoon turned, his silhouette a hard line against the glittering skyline, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that held no command, only a raw recognition. 14 months you were 10 feet from my door and I never saw you, he said, his hand hovering near hers on the cold marble railing. I built an empire to keep the world out only to realize I was the one trapped inside. Aisha didn't pull away, her gaze as level as the horizon and twice as distant. You didn't expect me to be more dangerous than your enemies, she whispered, her voice a soft, serrated edge in the quiet night. But the most dangerous thing in this room isn't a weapon, Ji-hoon. It's the truth you finally decided to see. He stepped closer, the possessive intensity in his eyes dark with a question that didn't require a single word. I want to offer you something that isn't a contract or a golden cage, he said, his breath a dangerous ghost against the side of her face. I want to know if the ghost I tried to buy is finally ready to stay for the man who used to put flowers on the table. Aisha smiled, a slow, predatory curve of the lips that held no warmth but possessed an absolute terrifying beauty. She reached up, her fingers grazing his jaw, her touch a final, dangerous promise. I will keep attending the meetings, she said, her voice dropping to a lethal velvet. And I will keep watching the shadows. But as for who belongs to whom? She leaned in, her eyes reflecting the cold, electric veins of the city below. That is a conversation for another evening. She turned a page in the story of her own life, leaving the answer hanging in the air like the scent of rain and spent gunpowder. Ji-hoon watched her profile, the complete ease of a woman entirely settled in her own space, knowing that for the first time in his life he didn't know the next move, and he wouldn't have it any other way. Above them the city glittered. Below, the war had ended, but for the boss and his ghost, the real game was just beginning.